Ben, keep him occupied while we get the sword.
Yo, Rock Puke! Come and get some!
Now, where last week's episode exemplified the greatest tendencies to come from the series and provided a grippingly fascinating escapade that brought about a shift in the show's tone and direction in terms of a long-standing plot thread and hero's journey, this week takes those newfound revelations and flips them on their heads, with a National Treasure-style excursion through the Mayan temples to beat a bunch of British knights over a mask that can unleash a physical god of war of mythological proportions.
I am not making this shit up!
That is as crazy as it sounds. However, for as wacky as it is, it manages to strike a balance that I can't say I acknowledge till now. It maintains a steady pace, concise scripting, goofy villains with an edge, and an almost expertly written character arc for Max that gives him a stellar showing for the first time in the show.
Good job.
This does as well remind me very much in the feeling of what they're doing with him here to that of Captain Rex from Star Wars Rebels when confronted with a chance to finish the Clone Wars on his own terms.
Good times.
Let me run down this episode and I'll let you know what I mean by the end. We begin with a dig site erupting into chaos when they drill too hard, when they dig too far and bear witness to a mask ascending from the sands of time to likely become a museum centerpiece.
What fun!
Cut to Max offering the kids some food for thought when he gets alerted of this discovery, and the sheer magnitude of its name is enough to scare the flowers off his shirt.
Boo! Made you jump!
He later regales Ben and Gwen in the mask of a Pook's tale and how it was one of the plumber's few failures to obtain and conceal from the world.
And you fail!
He explains in his monologue too that the destructive capabilities that this tiny relic can unlock are enough to level cities and possibly even the world. After Ben attempts to apply his usual sense of overconfident humour to the matter, Max rebuffs this and demands his help with gaining access to the dig site or simply stay out of the way. Ben goes grey matter in a segment that, to my knowledge, presents his transformation sequence for the first time, and he manages to get them inside, and they find the mask but are quickly confronted by the Forever Knights.
Why are you the way that you are? Honestly, every time I try to do something fun or exciting, you make it not that way.
Last scene, of course, when Ben states that they tried to slice and dice him. Their motives are made clear here, however, and they manage to acquire the relic, leaving Max and the crew behind. Max grows impatient of waiting for the Omnitrix to recharge and suits up in his old plumber gear to try and do a roadside hit and collect the mask, which he does so after a rather thrilling chase, and sometime later when the rust bucket is damaged during the melee, Ben discovers the mask can reveal a map to the temple they need, but Max determines that if they found this, Enoch likely did as well. Ben goes stinkfly to drag them all over there, but times out in the air and they miraculously survive the fall and continue to the temple doors where the Forever Knights are already looking to create one of their own. Ben realises that the mask can be used to locate the door and they manage to get inside. They encounter a few issues along the way, but after Ben and Gwen are captured by Enoch, Max is forced to relinquish the mask back to them. Enoch then decides to drop them down a hole in one of the most egregious acts that the show has ever given, and are likely on their way down to meet Darth Maul and ask how he survived.
You son of a bitch!
Ben goes forearms and manages to save himself and everybody else and starts to crawl back up and realises that maybe going to the Brawler of the Watch wasn't a bad idea. Enoch unlocks the chamber with the mask, revealing the sword, and as they go to retrieve it, they are engaged in a brawl with the Guardian that Max believes to be Apook. Just before this, Ben has to remind Max of what is important here when Max snaps back at him because Gwen needs a moment, and they believe that his obsession with this has put them at risk far too much. As they get into the chamber, Ben tackles the Guardian while Max and Gwen go after the sword. We then bear witness to one of the best battles in the show between Ben and the Guardian, and whilst this happens, Max makes constant turns back to save Gwen and aid Ben, with all this ending on Enoch pulling the sword from the stone. As he gloats about this moment, however, the sword suddenly does a Darksaber and becomes irrelevant by disintegrating in his hand. Max is visibly amused by this and states that's what you get for a sword that's over 6,000 years old, and because of its removal, the temple steadily starts to destroy itself and they make it out, but Enoch stays attempting to retrieve the dust, and they manage to fly away in Enoch's helicopter. Now, the biggest takeaway for me in this is, why don't they keep the helicopter? Surely Upgrade could have worked some of the mechanics of it into the rust bucket, I'm just saying.
He's got a point.
Jokes aside, this was a genuine delight of an episode and honestly switched the dynamics for once, removing the threat from the villains and placing it onto the reliable source for both Ben and Gwen in Max. Max was absolutely ruthless throughout this one, and I think we saw what type of a man he was back in the days of being a plumber, and likely the attitude that created such a disconnect between him and his sons, the adamant nature to him attempting to do what his entire team could not, and make good on the promise that they collectively never could, was akin to that, as I mentioned at the start, of Captain Rex from Star Wars Rebels. The episode in question is Season 3, Episode 6, and it focused on Rex, Kanan, Ezra, and Zeb discovering a remnant battalion of battle droids from the Clone Wars that are still operating under the command of a super tactical droid. Upon their capture, the droid Kalani informs them that he wants to play a game of war to prove which side was superior and end the Clone War for himself. Ezra agrees to this, with both himself, Kanan and Rex needing to return to where they are and save Zeb to complete the game. As this plays out, Rex starts to become triggered by his trauma, and it becomes a mission for him and his programming as a clone to complete, that puts both Ezra and Kanan at risk with little regard for them. The conflict ends in a similar fashion to this episode, where Ezra reminds Rex that the war is over, and neither the Republic nor the Separatists were ever meant to win the war, as the Empire took over in their place. So Rex needs to focus on the family he's found in the rebellion and keep going, just as Max needs to be reminded about his family in this with Ben and Gwen. But as we saw, the mission became a priority and transformed him for a moment into a state of ambivalence. I can appreciate that things never ended how Max wanted with the plumbers, as there would be an element of relief from achieving the final mission, but he fails to realise that he's continuing the legacy of them through Ben, so why put his grandkids at risk? What I will say though is the consequences of this episode feels redundant when you realise that the sword is just an empty trinket that doesn't possess a shred of danger beyond the mere mention of it. Possibly did at one point, but it fucking ain't now. Speaking of empty threats, the Forever Knights made their return here from their debut encounter with Ben and the nerd Howell Wainwright from Season 1. The reality to this organisation, however, is they're equally obsessed with collecting alien technology as the plumbers were, only they want to apply the tech for nefarious means, but as we saw with Ben and Howell in Season 1, they just aren't that threatening. I understand it's generally the way with shows like this that you have comical foils like the circus freaks and you have legitimate threats like Vilgax and Kevin, but in terms of the Knights, they kind of hit a middle impasse where they just can't seem to go either way. It all comes down to their words and when they're in large numbers that they actually are a threat. I don't mean to sour on this episode given the praise I've already offered it, but the Knights ultimately achieve nothing here. They certainly got a few good licks in against Max and the Guardian, but were done away with in spectacular fashion at the end, and it was left to Ben to save the day, which is a shift I was pleased to see here, by the way, with Ben stepping up when Max tapped out. He and Gwen prove that they can lead themselves when they need to, and in the case of Ben and his use of the watch, he understood exactly who to call on for each situation. Grey Matter made sense to sneak in, Stinkfly had the best chance to get them where they needed to be, and Forearms was categorically the most formidable counterweight to the Guardian. He showed a competence and maturity here that informs us of who he'll go on to become in the future shows, and I never thought I'd say this, but Ben was responsible and a voice of reason here.
That'll do, donkey. That'll do.
As for everything else in this episode, the very idea of gods in this universe shouldn't seem like a surprise given everything around it, but to see Ben struggle against the Guardian tells us that if there was a god of war to be actualized, Ben wouldn't be able to do anything about it currently until he had access to something like Alien X, which adds a glass ceiling to the show and a more than appropriate limitation for our heroes. The clash between Forearms and the Guardian has become one of my favourite brawls in this series, just pure brutality and possibly the worst fight that Ben has had since Vilgax. The humour was well placed throughout this one, the action was informative of everyone's capabilities, the plot itself was driven by the change in character motivations and that provided a refreshing take on the group. The use of aliens were logical, nothing stagnated or overstayed its welcome, and the goofy excesses that come from the show felt refined and pulled back to allow for mature nuances this time. It's my official diagnosis that we've witnessed a near perfect episode and I'm a fool for not seeing it sooner. Anyway, that's all I've got for this week, everyone. Thank you so much for stopping by. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to keep up to date for all of my reviews in the future. And until next week, everybody, take care, and I will catch you later.